This is the second video with Justin and Austin about the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, which are sometimes referred to as Japanese Marines. Although that is quite a debatable name, something that is discussed in the first video, so check it out there. Anyway, it is time for Justin and Austin to take over.
So kind of going back to our chronological coverage of their involvement in combat, what kind of roles did the Naval Landing Forces undertake in the initial 1941-42 conquests during the Southern Advance?
In the initial conquest, they focused almost entirely on the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. Only one Special Naval Landing Force unit actually moved southeast to attack Wake and then New Britain. The rest were focused on capturing harbors, canals, airfields, and oil fields in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. They usually worked alongside the Army, and the Army, again, was pulling most of the weight while the Navy focused on securing areas that could be used for fleet and air service. After March of 1942, most of these units were then reorganized into garrisons, such as Special Base Forces or Guard units to hold the captured areas. Additional waves of Special Naval Landing Forces were then created and sent again to the south, this time focusing on reinforcing the Solomons and capturing New Guinea. New Guinea proved to be the most disastrous and kind of was where their campaign began to be halted with their defeat at Milne Bay.
I guess kind of bleeding into this, is there anything notable you'd like to discuss about kind of the defensive battles from 1942 to 45? Because, obviously people typically associate Marines or landing forces with offensive operations, obviously, or generally amphibious in nature. But obviously with the course of the war, the Naval Landing Forces kind of from that mid to late war period kind of switched over to a primarily defensive role. Was this something unusual for them? I mean, obviously we've covered basically in Shanghai, they were stuck in a defensive role, at least initially, in those actions. So it's not entirely alien to them, but I'll let you cover that there.
True. So after the failure at Milne Bay, there was basically no more sizable naval landing force offensives. They switched to the defense. Now they're focusing on securing the Solomon Islands, where they were able to somewhat slow the push of Allied forces until the end of the war. The units basically started to disregard mobility, and you'd see way more companies. For instance, one of the units sent to the Solomons, the Kure 6th Special Naval Landing Force, it had 7 companies and about 2,000 men, and only 2 of those companies were conventional light infantry. The rest were heavy mortars, field guns, anti-aircraft guns, etc. So we can see that they're now focusing on being dug in and kind of holding the territory they're at rather than moving forward. Outside of Special Naval Landing Forces, we see there's a lot more guard units. Basically, every big battle in the Pacific, there'd be some sort of guard unit. So from 1942, in the summer, we see guard units at Guadalcanal. Then kind of jumping forward a bit to 1944, we see at Kwajalein, Biak, Hollandia, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu. There's all guard units fighting there to hold those islands. And then in the very end of the war, we see guard units in Burma and Tarakan trying to hold their areas. Now, almost all these battles were total losses with very few survivors because guard units, although they were sizable with usually 1,000 men or more in these areas, they just didn't have enough men to put up a good fight against Allied forces. In the Philippines, we see a lot of special base forces fighting as well. Again, organized very defensively. The most significant battles would be in Manila, Mindanao, and Cebu in 1945.
I guess bleeding into this, how were landing forces going to be used in the defense of the home islands like Katsugo?
The Battle of Okinawa kind of gives us a glimpse into what the last stand would look like. They were just taking tons of random sailors from units, even air units, and merging them together into combined naval landing forces with whatever weapons they had to try to hold areas. Around May, they began forming a ton of coastal harbor guard units at major cities across Japan. And then the major naval bases like Yokosuka, Sasebo, Maizuru, and Kure, as well as Chinkai in Korea, they formed a ton of combined special naval landing forces. But it's hard to compare them to the previous ones we've seen because these units were just using whatever they had and random troops from schools. By the end, they had about 40,000 special naval landing forces in homeland Japan and 8,000 more in Korea. Their weapons would have been really lacking at this point. They were really low on infantry weapons, but there was some other heavier weapons stockpiled like rockets and mortars and tanks. So it would have been definitely disastrous, but very unique formed units that were planned to be used.
So I guess now we can talk a little bit about equipment. There was obviously overlap in kit with the Imperial Army, but also a lot. I mean, you mentioned earlier Bergman submachine guns that were unique to the Naval Landing Forces. So what were some of the infantry weapons commonly used by Naval Landing Forces?
Sure. So they generally were using what the Army used, but they kind of were slow to follow up with what they were doing. For instance, the Army adopted the famous Type 38 rifle as their service rifle in 1905, but it would not be until 10 years later that the Japanese Navy adopted it for the Naval Landing Forces. Now, in the early Showa era, uh, they started to kind of look elsewhere to arm themselves. So we see they imported the Bergman submachine guns in 1929, and then in the mid 1930s, they started to use the Austrian MP34, or otherwise known as Steyr Solothurn S1100 submachine guns as well. They were using British Lewis heavy machine guns, and basically whatever the Army wouldn't give them, they tried to find something else to make up for it. They also had Italian Carcanos to a small extent, chambered in their 6.5 by 50 millimeter round. In times of need, they did have to rely on Army kit again, so you can see them using like Army boots, helmets, gas masks, some cold weather uniforms. In Shanghai, you can see a lot of Army helmets in use by the Navy. Their uniforms were definitely different, but in terms of weapons and like the equipment that went for them, for like ammo pouches and bayonets, it was the same as the Army.
So what about armored vehicles like tanks? I tend to associate them most with is there's a lot of photographs of primarily in Shanghai of naval landing forces making use of armored cars, but they also had, for example, Type 89 tanks as well. How were they kind of integrated into the naval landing forces, and what kind of equipment were they using?
So starting in 1928, the Shanghai Naval Landing Force got about 9 Vickers Crossley Model 25 armored cars from the UK. Originally, they just kind of stuck them into the battalions, but they figured that didn't work very well. So uh, Ota Minoru actually said, why don't we make like a company for these instead? So they made their first armored company. And then in the Battle of Shanghai in 1932, they used this armored company quite effectively against Chinese forces. So the Navy really started to see the value of armored cars. And following that, they began using Type Sumida armored cars, introduced in 1932, and then Type 93 the following year. Both of these were domestically produced 6-wheeled armored cars made at the Ishikawa Jima Motor Factory. You could see all these armored cars again in the Second Battle of Shanghai. Regarding tanks, Naval Landing Forces began using them around 1933. They first used Type 89 light tanks, which were the early A-type models. And then they also got some British Carden Lloyd tankettes, which they actually considered a light tank, even though there's no tank gun on them, and called them a Type K light tank. Um, tank training was mostly conducted at Yokosuka and Tateyama Naval Gunnery Schools. Around the mid-30s, they then began to use the Type 89 medium tanks, still the A models, but later versions. In the late 1930s, then we can see Japanese tankettes make their debut with Naval Landing Forces as well. They started with the Type 94. Now, these were actually classified as light armored cars, but they did use them a little differently than the previous wheeled ones we'd seen. They also used the Type 97, but in really small numbers. In the Pacific War, we can see they started to use the Type 95 light tanks. The first debut of them was in 1942 at Milne Bay. They never really got to use them very effectively because they're always against either troops that had tanks or good anti-tank weapons. They also did adopt the Type 2 Special Launch Craft, which was a light amphibious tank based off the Type 95, but the armor was much less effective because it didn't have good angling to accommodate for the flotation platoons. Now, they intended to use the Type 2 Special Launch Craft for amphibious assaults, but since it was adopted in late 1942 and the deployments of it began in 43, they really were mostly just in a defensive role. But there was at least one unit known as the Ito Naval Landing Force, which employed about 5 of these in a landing operation against Allied forces on Ormoc Bay in 1944. They were destroyed, but at least we can kind of see an idea of what Naval Landing Forces doing amphibious armor offensives would have looked like. Now, they did have more amphibious tanks and some Army tanks like the Type 97, medium tank, and some experimental tanks of their own, but none of them actually made it outside of Japan. By this point, it was like impossible to ship anything of that size outside of the country without it getting sunk. In general, the Naval Landing Forces don't have like a super interesting armored history other than within Shanghai. Otherwise, it was mostly just tanks getting destroyed on garrison islands in the Pacific, or a small number of them harassing relatively underarmed units in China.
So what about artillery and anti-aircraft? So you've mentioned obviously the air defense units, and you've also kind of mentioned in passing some artillery. So do they make pretty extensive use of artillery?
Certainly, artillery has kind of been part of the Naval Landing Forces tradition since their inception. Actually, most Naval Landing Force officers are well trained in naval gunnery, so they're used to using ship guns. And in the early days, they'd actually just often haul ship guns off the deck of the ships, put them on wheels, and use them to fire at the enemy. Now we can see heavier artillery starting to be used at Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War, and then in Tsingtao, 1914. As for lighter weapons that were a little more eloquent than ship guns just brought on shore, we had Army weapons like the Type 41 mountain guns and Type 92 battalion guns used by the Navy. They were used quite a bit in China and very much in the Pacific as well. With the more static units in the Pacific, you could see heavier and heavier coastal artillery. There was even like some guns from cruisers that were just hauled off of them when they were damaged and put back on shore and used by Naval Landing Forces. As for anti-aircraft, we can see the Type 93 13mm autocannon in 1933 began to be used. A good amount of the Naval Landing Forces wanting to use this stems from the first Shanghai incident, where their headquarters got bombarded quite a bit, so they realized they needed better air defenses on the ground. Following that, we have the most famous anti-aircraft weapon used by Naval Landing Forces, and probably the entire Navy, which was the Type 96 25mm autocannon, which of course the air defense units used, but also special base forces, Naval Landing Forces, and all sorts of other units across the Pacific had them. They're usually used in a 2 or 3 mount, and they were kind of aging by the time World War II happened, so they weren't that good. But some of these units were so well armed with them that they managed to take out quite a few planes nonetheless. As for bigger anti-aircraft weapons, they had 12cm naval guns, and they also used the Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun from the Army quite a bit as well.
Related to artillery or anything, was there any doctrine in place or training for calling in naval gunfire from offshore to support the Naval Landing Forces?
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, they've been doing that pretty much in every offensive operation they did. They'd usually get their aircraft and then ships to bombard before they landed on shore, which actually it caused a lot of casualties in China and a lot of damage in the Pacific as well.
Like, did they have people on shore with a radio or anything like that directing fire, or was it kind of run in parallel?
Usually, with a big operation, the commander of the fleet is commanding the Naval Landing Forces, so they would just command the ships to kind of do a pre-bombardment. In cases like Shanghai, it's a bit more organized, where they'll have signalers with flags or radio men that can be communicating with the ships and aircraft and calling it in to do the bombardments.
So what were some of the reasons for the differences in equipment between the Naval Landing Forces and the Imperial Army?
Definitely part of it was kind of a bit of rivalry, but also just naval pride. The Navy really wanted to look different from the Army, so they were quite against wearing Army uniforms and exact Army equipment like insignia or that. You can kind of see it with other aspects of the Japanese Army and Navy, like how the pilots wore different uniforms. Surprisingly, though, actually, some Special Naval Landing Force officers, like in the Sasebo 6 Special Naval Landing Force in 1933, doing their action reports, said that their equipment, like canteens, equipment packs, were lacking, and they should just adopt Army-style ones instead. So the upper guys in the Navy were really into looking separate from the Army, but those on the ground were not all against it.
So in your view, what were some strengths and weaknesses of the system of Naval Landing Forces as it developed over the decades?
They were very open to new types of organizations and flexible with, reorganizing that. I think that kind of stems from the original ad hoc tradition of just sending ship crews onto the shore to make a naval landing force. They're also really open to adopting new weapons and like to use foreign weapons, unlike the Army. We can see that with them using submachine guns 10 years before the Army adopted the Type 100. They used the Lewis machine gun about 10 years before the Type 92 machine gun came into use as well. So they actually had better firepower for the machine gun crews than the Army during that period. That definitely gave them an advantage that they were more open to those things. However, the training was really lacking for naval landing forces. Most of them only had basic training that they got while they were a sailor. So, of course, as a sailor, most of your training is going to be about seafaring and how to work on a vessel. Infantry training was only a very small part of that. Their manpower was really lacking during the war. They had less and less officers with field experience, and they were relying more and more on promoting petty officers into officer positions. And those officers didn't have full school training and usually were quite lacking in terms of quality. The budget was also quite bad for the Navy landing forces. They were really put kind of at the bottom of the spending. Everything was focused on shipbuilding and aviation. And they also suffered from officers like Iwabuchi at Manila, who didn't really have much infantry training, but also didn't want to work with the Army. And people with that sort of mindset really brought the Naval Landing Forces into despair because they couldn't continue with the mindset that was successful in the early days when they worked with the Army. So the rivalry between the two forces definitely had a big negative impact on them in the later days of the war.
And I guess to expand on that a little bit, how much of the existence of these various naval landing forces was owed to Army-Navy inter-service rivalry, and how much was a reasonable division of duties between the services?
I would say when they originated, it was really not uncommon for any nation to have a navy with naval infantry or their own Marines. But as we move forward into like the 1930s and then early 1940s, we can see the Army has now a clear mindset that we don't want to have our troops guarding naval assets. The Navy has to do this on their own. In the early days, it was more a division of duties. So we can just see, okay, the Army is going to move inland and the Navy infantry will take coastal areas. But then it grew increasingly to the point where the Navy is kind of just having to do the Army jobs in their sections of the Pacific because the Army doesn't want to waste their troops there.
So thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of people listening have. If they want to know more, now is your time to plug your stuff.
Sure. So, of course, I've got my book, Rikusentai, the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Japanese Naval Landing Forces. It's heavily illustrated with tons of period photographs, basically all using period Japanese sources that I've translated. So I think it probably gives the best insight over all the types of units and the organization out of anything available. I also have my website, rikusentai.net, where I post tons of archived photos that I'm gathering in Japan.
And if people want to follow you on social media, what's your English Twitter?
It's Adachi _ Austin _.
Still better than mine. Well, thank you very, very much. And I hope everyone listening has enjoyed the talk, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Great. Thank you so much.